go ahead and begin once again. Last time we had started talking about the female reproductive cycle. Today we're going to continue talking about the female reproductive cycle. Excuse me, and hopefully my voice will last. By the way, after today we have a grand total of 3 more lectures. Your final exam is in fact 2 weeks from today. So the remainder of the course, we'll spend the rest of today talking about this. On Tuesday, we'll probably finish up on this set of slides, talking about development. And then the following Thursday, I have some other things that we can take a look at as well. And then the Tuesday before the exam, I'm planning to use as a review session. Because again, we just don't have that more information. So again, we'll see how it goes. But I need to get the button over here. And again, last time we were talking about the ovarian cycle, and we want to continue. By the way, there will be another lab quiz showing up by the end of next week, if not sooner than that. There will be another lab quiz showing up as well. Please make sure you get that taken too. Also, if you've not turned in all of your labs, and some of you are quite a bit behind on doing your physio-X's, you might want to catch up. Again, I do accept late assignments, so turn them in if you haven't done so. All right. Last time we were talking about the ovarian cycle, and I'd like to begin talking about the ovarian cycle again, because again, this is going to control the uterine cycle, better known as the menstrual cycle. Because the hormones that are being used to control the uterus are being produced here from the ovaries. And once again, it all begins with a rise in GnRH, which leads to production of LH and FSH. The rise in FSH causes stimulation of the follicles, which then produce estrogen. And as that estrogen grows and develops, that follicle gets bigger and bigger and bigger, produces more and more estrogen. It also starts to produce inhibin as well, and the inhibin turns off the other follicles, and prevents them from getting started. You'll notice that our FSH levels start to drop off here. That's because the inhibin turns off the FSH up in here. As we producing estrogen. That will then cause the GnRH, the estrogen and the GnRH will then combine in a positive feedback mechanism around here in the middle of the cycle to create a large surge in LH. That will cause ovulation. So LH, the LH surge is what produces ovulation, the release of the egg that has been inside of that developing follicle. And then once the egg is released, the remains of the follicle turns into the corpus luteum. So the LH, in addition to causing ovulation, causes formation of the corpus luteum from the remains of the follicle. The corpus luteum continues to produce estrogen and now also produces progesterone. And as long as estrogen and progesterone are around, pregnancy can occur. If implantation does occur, it's going to occur right about here in the cycle. And then this path will continue on for the next roughly 3 months, at which point the placenta will take over. If pregnancy does not occur, implantation does not take place, the corpus luteum gives up, and these levels start to drop. As the progesterone and the estrogen levels drop, the inhibin levels drop as well, which releases allows the FSH to be produced again, and we start our cycle over. So again, that is what is happening at the ovary. This all needs to be coupled now with what's going to happen with the uterus. Again, we can see this graphically. Once again, under the influence of FSH, the follicle goes from being a primordial follicle to a primary follicle to a secondary follicle to a mature follicle. The primary follicles are ones that begin to grow and develop and thicken and make estrogen. As it begins to fill with fluid here, it becomes a secondary follicle and continues to grow and produce estrogen and inhibin. And as it gets nice and big and fast, that is then a mature or a grafted or a tertiary follicle, depending on who you want to talk to. So that's what's happening here with the follicles. As this follicle is getting nice and big, it's producing inhibin, which is turning off the other ones. Again, We started with a set of follicles that began to grow and develop. Only one will go to maturity. Only one of these follicles will go to maturity. The others will be turned off by the inhibin. The inhibin will then turn the others off. With that big surge in the middle, we get ovulation. The egg comes out, or I shouldn't say the egg, the secondary oocyte comes out, because at this point we are in metaphase 2. This is at metaphase 2 of meiosis. As it comes out, the LH then causes the remains of the follicle to thicken and turn yellow and turn into the corpus luteum, which will also produce now progesterone in addition to the estrogen. And again, as long as that corpus luteum is around, we can maintain the endometrium and be ready for pregnancy to occur. So that's what's happening at the ovaries. This all needs to be synced up now with what's happening with the uterus, or the uterine cycle. And the uterine cycle has to do with preparing the uterus for pregnancy to occur. Again, it occurs in several phases. First of all, we have what is known as the menstrual phase, and day 1 of the menstrual cycle is the first day of menstrual bleeding. And what's happening during this point, in the absence of estrogen, we cannot maintain the endometrial lining, and it sloughs off, and it comes off. And that's the survival. So again, the endometrial wall is sloughed off due to the fact there's not enough progesterone and estrogen around to maintain it. It sloughs off and washes away anything that might be inside the uterus. This is followed by the proliferative phase. Again, during this period, we're seeing estrogen levels rise, and that's causing the endometrium to grow and develop and get nice and thick and rich and full of blood and ready to accept an incoming embryo. So again, rising estrogen levels from the follicle leads to thickening and development of the endometrium during the proliferative phase. And this is going to last roughly until the middle of the cycle, at which point the corpus luteum will start to form and start to produce progesterone, which puts us into the secretory phase. And during the secretory phase, we have endometrial glands that enlarge and maintain the integrity of the endometrium so long as that progesterone and estrogen happen to be around. If the progesterone and estrogen levels start to drop, we're no longer able to maintain the endometrial lining, it sloughs off, and we start the cycle over again. So that is what is happening here inside the uterus. Again, I already said that. So what's it look like? So again, at the beginning of the cycle over here, we have the sloughing off of the endometrial wall. It goes away and detaches and comes out. As estrogen levels begin to rise, the endometrial lining over here begins to thicken, develop, get nice and big and thick as that estrogen level starts to rise. You'll notice down here we have a number of glands that are developing down here as well. During the proliferative phase, they are not being used yet. But as the progesterone levels start to go up, we start getting secretion from those uterine glands ready to nourish an incoming embryo. If said embryo occurs, it's going to show up right about here. And that will then help to nourish that embryo as it continues along its developmental pathway. If the embryo does not occur, corpus luteum gives up, progesterone levels start to drop, estrogen levels start to drop, inhibin levels drop as well, and we're no longer able to maintain the endometrial lining here, and we get rid of it again, and we start over. So that is what is happening here at the uterus. Putting it all together, it looks something like this. By the way, you might want to take a look at this figure. If you understand what's going on in this figure, you understand what's happening with the female reproductive cycle fairly well. So you might want to take a look at this. Number one, we start up here with increases levels of GnRH, leading to increases in FSH and LH. The FSH causes the follicle to grow and develop. As it grows and develops, it produces estrogen. That estrogen causes the growth and repair of the endometrial lining, getting it ready for an incoming embryo. At the middle of the cycle, we see an increase in estrogen that interacts with the GnRH to cause a big surge in LH in the middle of the cycle, which leads to ovulation, and the egg is released from the follicle. The follicle then under the influence of the LH, turns yellow, gets thicker, and turns into the corpus luteum, which in addition to continuing to produce estrogen, now produces progesterone as well, leading to the secretory phase down here at the uterus, allowing those endometrial glands to start producing what they're producing to help maintain the endometrial lining, as well as prepare for an incoming embryo. If the embryo shows up, this phase will continue throughout the rest of pregnancy, until the end of pregnancy. This phase will continue. If an embryo does not show up, the corpus luteum gives up, stops making progesterone, stops making estrogen, stops making inhibin. And we are no longer able to maintain this nice thick endometrial wall, and it sloughs off. And that is the female reproductive cycle in a nutshell. Any questions on the female reproductive cycle? We'll look at it again. So that is what is happening inside here. A few more details. Once again, ovulation occurs in the middle of the cycle. The first day of the cycle is the first day of menstruation. And as we're sloughing off this endometrial wall here, we're also removing anything else that might be inside the uterus, including any non-viable eggs or non-viable fetuses will be sloughed off as well. With ovulation, there is a change in body temperature. We do see a spike in the body temperature with ovulation. By the way, that sloughing off here is actually fairly important as well because it also takes away any precancerous cells with it. If you stop cycling, the chances of uterine cancer go up, not by huge amounts, but it does remove any precancerous cells in here as well. All right, so that is what is happening here with the menstrual cycle, the monthly cycle. Again, this is all involving a bunch of hormones, which are all shown here on this figure here. And you'll notice this looks a lot like the figure we showed you for the male reproductive system, only the timelines are different. And down here we have, instead of testosterone, we have estrogen. Where's estrogen? Here's progesterone. Here's estrogen. Estrogen and progesterone instead. But otherwise, the FSH, the LH, the inhibin, those are the same hormones. Once again, release of GnRH leads to production of FSH, leading to production of estrogen, does all the things estrogen does, and also production of progesterone upon the production of LH. Leads to this, which causes complete aromatic divisions and other fun things in there as well. So again, take a look at this figure and you're going, it's a good thing to take a look at. Once again, there are a number of hormones involved. Number one, GnRH. This comes from the hypothalamus, and it is released from the hypothalamus and turned off by estrogen and progesterone. So we do have negative feedback here, keeping it from coming back up again when in the middle of the cycle. Because we don't want to start a second cycle until we finish with the cycle we have. This prevents us from getting pregnant twice. If you're already carrying a fetus, you don't want to get pregnant again. That would just screw things up. It also stimulates FSH and LH secretion from the anterior pituitary. The FSH stimulates follicular development. The LH induces ovulation and causes formation of the corpus luteum. The estrogen comes from the ovaries, promotes growth of the endometrial lining, and keeps it healthy and ready to accept an incoming embryo, as does the progesterone as well. So again, lots and lots of fun hormones involved in all of this. We need to talk a little bit more now about estrogen specifically. Estrogen does in the female what testosterone does in the male. Again, both men and women do produce estrogen. In men get their estrogen from the adrenal glands. Women get lots of it from the ovaries. And it is a growth factor. It stimulates bone and muscle growth. It goes up at puberty and you get bigger. So again, it does stimulate bone and muscle growth. Importantly here, however, it also leads to fusion of the epiphyseal plates inside of your bones. And this is why women tend to be shorter than men. Because the growth of the bones is shorter, grow for a shorter period. As the estrogen is produced, it leads to maturation of the bones faster than it does in males. Again, it leads to fusion of the epiphyseal plates. Once the plates are fused, that's as long as that bone's going to get. So estrogen is important in fusion of the epiphyseal plates. Women have more estrogen, women's bones end up being shorter. This is a large part why men and women have different sizes. It does maintain the female secondary sexual characteristics, hair patterns, hair growth patterns, fat deposition. Again, women tend not to have hairy faces and chests as opposed to men. Women tend to put their fat on their hips and their thighs, men put it on their bellies, things along this time. Women tend to have more fat subcutaneously, more subcutaneous fat. It also affects the central nervous system. It increases the sex drive in the hypothalamus, among other things, and yes, in the middle of the ovarian cycle, women do become more sexually, what's the word I'm looking for? The word that's coming to me is not an appropriate word. But women become more sexually receptive. That's a good word. More receptive to the sexual act. In the middle of the cycle, that estrogen level goes up. It also means that when that at the beginning and end of the cycle, the sex drive does go down. That's all. It maintains the accessory reproductive glands and organs as well. Again, particularly of the uterus. It also, again, initiates repair and growth of the endometrium, helps everything go the way it should. And that is what is happening with the ovaries and the uterus. We now need to consider some of the other organs involved, including the uterine tubes. Again, you may have learned these earlier as the fallopian tubes, and we're trying to get away from using people's names. Fallopian doesn't really say anything here other than Dr. Fallopia. But anyway, describe them. Uterine tubes is a much more descriptive term of what's going on here. And again, following ovulation, these are there to get the oocyte from the ovary into the uterus. They're there to get the oocyte from the ovary into the uterus. In order to do that, these are muscular tubes about yay long. About that long. And they allow the uterus to, the oocyte to make its way into the uterus. It takes about a week for that oocyte to travel through the uterine tube. It takes about a week. Again, and they're nice muscular tubes that do undergo peristalsis. On the ends of them, we have what are called fimbriae, and they help to guide the oocyte into the infundibulum, the opening of the uterine tube. Again, the uterine tube is not attached to the ovary in any meaningful way. So that oocyte, once it is produced, has to make its way into the uterine tube. And aiding it along that way, we have peristaltic contractions that help to create a little bit of a current in there to help suck the egg in. And it is ciliated. The interior of this is a ciliated epithelium that helps to sweep the egg along. The egg and then the embryo. Again, cilia in the infundibulum, the opening of the uterine tube, and peristaltic contractions create a current to sweep the oocyte into the uterine tube and then into the uterus and make its way into the uterus. And again, this takes about a week to occur. This peristaltic contraction starts just before ovulation. So these peristaltic contractions are not occurring all the time. They start a little bit before ovulation. And apparently some women can actually feel this. Don't ask me, I don't know. But I've been told that some women can actually feel that those peristaltic contractions starting, indicating that they know it is happening. But again, it's activated a few hours before ovulation to help move that oocyte and later embryo along. Fertilization typically occurs within the uterine tube, specifically towards the outer portion of it, in the ampulla of the uterine tube. Fertilization can occur anywhere you have egg and sperm put together. So as soon as that oocyte is ovulated, it can be fertilized. Usually where it meets up with sperm is inside the uterine tube, because outside of it, things just get too much dispersed out there. That oocyte, once it is produced, remains viable for about a day and a half. remains viable for about a day and a half. And it takes about 7 days for it to descend into the uterus. When it reaches the uterus, it is no longer a secondary oocyte, it is an embryo in what is known as the blastocyst stage. So again, it is a blastocyst that is going to be implanting into the uterus. Again, it's going to be fertilized towards the opening of the uterine tube, and it's going to grow and develop as it makes its way through the tube into the uterus. All right, it's not actually going to grow, but it's going to develop. All right. And again, implantation occurs in the uterus. The only place in the female reproductive system where an embryo can grow to term is inside the uterus. And if it implants anyplace else, it will not survive. It can, however, implant in other locations. Most of the time, if it implants someplace else, it's not going to get enough nutrition into it to where it can survive. Because again, we need a really rich blood flow going in there, like we see in the endometrium. But if that does not occur, most of the time the testis to the intestinal walls or something like that, it will not survive. Her period will be a bit late, but otherwise she'll never realize she was on the ground. However, if it implants inside the uterine tube, it could potentially produce enough of a placenta to allow it to continue to develop for a while, for several months. If this occurs, bad results come of this. And that's as it's starting to grow in there, the uterus is evolved to stretch out. Again, it has to go from something this big to something this big in order to hold that uterus. Very few structures in your body could ever stretch that much, and the uterine tubes cannot stretch that much. So if it occurs inside the uterine tubes, it can attach, it can start to grow, and expand and exceed the capacity of the uterine tube to allow that growth to continue. In which case it causes the uterine tubes to burst, and then leads to massive internal bleeding, and the mother dies. So again, that is what is known as an ectopic pregnancy. A pregnancy of any place other than the uterus is ectopic. And as soon as they are discovered, they must be aborted. Otherwise, you do risk the death of the mother. The fetus will not survive, and probably won't get to the fetal stage. The embryo will not survive. It's not ever going to get sufficient nutrition in there. And it can lead to the death of the mother. So again, they must be removed as soon as they are found. All right, and that's what the uterine tubes are there for. But assuming everything goes the way it does, and we produce a nice, healthy, happy neonate, we then need to nourish that newborn infant. And so we need to talk a bit about lactation. Again, we are mammals, which means we do need to actually produce milk. We do produce milk. By the way, both men and women have all the parts to make milk. Men do have what are called lactiferous glands or mammary glands. They're just not active. They're just never activated. Give men the right set of hormones, men can produce milk. Men are quite capable of producing milk, probably not as much as women do, because again, these are not well developed. But if we take a look here at the breast, it's roughly roughly round in shape. But there is an extension that goes up into the towards there, but there's an axillary extension to it as well. And the whole breast here is divided into segments. It's divided into these segments by what are called suspensory ligaments. Now, what you're looking at here, we see these nice big plump, what are known as lactiferous glands or mammary glands. This would be actin glands hanging out in here. Most of the time, they're not nearly well developed like this. If you're not actively producing milk, they're not going to be this thing. But we do have lobules here. And each of these lobules here, these are modified sweat glands. These are modified sweat glands. Take a typical sweat gland, add some extra protein, some extra fat to it, some extra calcium, you have milk. That's what milk is. Milk is modified sweat. And again, it's divided up into these segments, each of which contains one of these lobes. These lobes are divided up into lobules, and these are the mammary glands themselves. These are, of course, exocrine glands, and each of these glands feeds into what is called a lactiferous duct. So each of these will feed into a duct here that then comes out through the nipple separately. It's not a single passage through the nipple. Each of these lobes has a tube that comes out in the middle. So we're talking a bunch of small little ducts that pass out through the nipple. I'm assuming I don't need to show you what a nipple is. But again, the nipple is also surrounded by a pigmented area known as the areola, which again I assume I don't need to show you about. But anyways, each of these goes into a lactiferous duct. Right behind the nipple, there is a swollen portion of it right here known as the lactiferous sinus. That is where the milk will gather before being expressed. Again, we only produce milk traditionally after childbirth. Again, the only time we have the right number of hormones and the right combination of hormones is after childbirth. Prior to that, by the way, you don't actually produce milk until a couple of days after birth. Prior to that, there could be some fluid that comes out here. That's called colostrum. It will nourish the infant for the first couple of days, but it's not nearly as rich as actual milk is. So again, these will be getting ready to go. And these mammary glands will grow and enlarge during the pregnancy. Some of the hormones involved with pregnancy will lead to growth and enlargement of the mammary glands. By the way, most of the breast itself is fat. Most of this bottom is fat. All right. So again, suspensory ligaments divide the breast into various lobes. Each of the lobules produce milk, and they produce it in response to a hormone called prolactin. Prolactin comes from the anterior pituitary in response to several other hormones being present. So there are several hormones that are required to be present to allow prolactin production. But again, you need prolactin to make the milk. During pregnancy, prolactin production is turned off by progesterone. So again, this is actively turned off during pregnancy. The lactiferous ducts conduct the milk from the lobules to the lactiferous sinus, where it then hangs out and is gathered there, and will eventually be released due to the presence of another hormone known as oxytocin. Oxytocin is required for the expression of the milk. And this is going to be caused by a contraction of the lactiferous ducts, squeezing the milk out in response to oxytocin. So again, milk expression, also called milk letdown, is due to oxytocin. The production of the milk is due to prolactin. The expression of the milk is due to oxytocin. So there are a couple of hormones that we need here to make this work. So again, lactation, milk production, is controlled by prolactin and oxytocin. Prolactin is controlled by prolactin-releasing hormone from the hypothalamus, comes down into the anterior pituitary, causes production of prolactin, which then stimulates the mammary glands to start making milk. It is inhibited by dopamine and also by progesterone. Both will prevent this from being produced. However, in order to get milk, you also have to have growth hormone, thyroxine, and insulin. Growth hormone, thyroxine, and insulin, thyroxine, of course, being one of the thyroid hormones. You need those three hormones present in order to make prolactin. So again, if you don't have those, you don't make sufficient amounts of milk. So again, we need growth hormone, thyroxine, and insulin. That will allow production of prolactin so long as you don't have an inhibitory hormone hanging out there as well. During pregnancy, PRH rises, leading to increases in prolactin, but it is inhibited by progesterone. So the prolactin is going to get the mammary glands ready to make milk, but they're not going to actually produce the milk because the progesterone interferes with this. After delivery, This progesterone, by the way, is coming from the placenta. The progesterone is coming out of the placenta. So after pregnancy, the placenta comes out. We are no longer making progesterone, and that removes the inhibition, and then we can allow prolactin to be produced. Or prolactin will then rise and allow actual milk production to occur. Suckling of the infant continues the production of the prolactin, will allow continued production of prolactin through a feedback mechanism. When the infant is weaned, you no longer get that feedback loop. That feedback, by the way, involves oxytocin, which we'll come back to in a minute. You no longer get that feedback loop going on, and we turn off prolactin, we turn off milk production. All right. So putting it all together again. Again, milk production requires prolactin and oxytocin. Prolactin is coming from the anterior pituitary, comes down here to the anterior lobe, and causes milk production to occur. Suckling of the infant causes release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary. Oxytocin then causes contraction of lactiferous ducts and lactiferous sinuses, and the milk comes out. Again, this requires the suckling of the infant. Oxytocin causes, I just said that. It turns off the inhibitory hormones for the prolactin and continues prolactin production. So prolactin production continues so long as that oxytocin produced by the suckling of the infant continues. We need to talk a little bit about this oxytocin here. Oxytocin, in addition to causing milk letdown, is also what is sometimes referred to as the love hormone. This hormone is also very much involved in pair bonding. Specifically, the bonding that occurs between mother and infant, that is dependent on this oxytocin that is coming out during the suckling of the infant. It is also produced as the hormone that's responsible for orgasm, which helps the mating pairs to bond as well. So again, oxytocin has not only effects here on the breast, it also has effects on the central nervous system, with having to do with pair bonding, very much so. All right, and that is how we make milk. Any question on milk production? Yes.
Not the milk production so much, but when you have a baby, they always make you do skin to skin to help bond.
Again, that oxytocin there is due to touch receptors. So that helps with bonding with the infant as well, and infants just like to be touched. It's just very good for infants to be touched. That is part of our evolutionary history. Traditionally, infants would be held against the skin, and without clothing being in the way, obviously. It wasn't until we went to clothing. But, so yeah, it's very good to infants require touch. Yes.
So when you're nursing, I know you're not like a lactation specialist, but so like the infant's saliva, they say can go into the mother's, where does it go? So it produces what the baby needs, like certain antibodies.
Okay, that's not caused by the infant's saliva going.
Okay.
That's because the antibodies can cross into the milk from the mother's bloodstream.
Okay, so how does your breast know what your baby needs?
It doesn't know it. We produce milk, and milk contains what your infant needs.
Okay.
Milk is a complete food source. Your infant needs milk. That's all. And so again, we as mammals have evolved that milk is what we need, and we produce milk. In terms of what antibodies are there, you get the antibodies your mother has during breastfeeding. You get whatever antibodies she has. And presumably she has the antibodies to whatever happens to be around her, which would be the ones that you would need as well. So again, it's not so much that there's any sort of feedback mechanism going back and forth saying that it doesn't have immunity to X, Y, or Z, so much as whatever the mother has been producing antibodies to will end up in the milk. Many antibodies will cross into the milk and then be delivered into the infant. As we talked about when we talked about the immune system, this would be a naturally acquired passive immunity. Naturally acquired passive immunity. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Can the infant saliva end up inside the nipple? Probably. I don't see why it wouldn't. But it wouldn't get very far. Wouldn't get very far. Probably no problem with the lactative science. Because remember, as the milk is being produced, it's flushing it out.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions? By the way, because of that immunity that is possible to receive from the breast milk, we do recommend that you at least try breastfeeding, if possible, because it does contain a lot of antibodies and other fun things. However, if for some reason you can't, these days we do have excellent formulas that are perfectly good and healthy as well. Or if you don't produce enough milk. There are women who, for one reason or another, just don't produce sufficient milk. And we now have ways of getting around that. So use it. By the way, buy your formula, don't try to make your own. You're not food chemists, you don't really know how to do it. All right, having said that, that is lactation, and again, proper nutrition when you're young does wonders for you when you're old. Again, it's very good. All right, so that's what happens after we're born, but before we do that, we need to get born in the first place, which means we need to fertilize that egg. So how does that occur? Well, number one, we need to get the sperm to actually become mobile, and that is known as capacitation. Part of the reason why men produce so much sperm is because most of that sperm never becomes active. It does not actually become active, doesn't start moving around, and doesn't make it into the uterine tubes. Why did I quit flowing here? But most sperm deposited in the female reproductive tract never gets anywhere near where it needs to end up. And there are a variety of reasons for this. First of all, there's no guiding system going on there. It just sort of swims around, and half of it's going to go in the wrong direction. So it's not necessarily going to end up in the right place in the first place. Secondly, only about 10% of it ever becomes activated. Only about 10% of the sperm ever actually becomes activated. And again, to where it can actually get out to the oocyte and fertilize it. And this is a process known as capacitation. Capacitation is the activation of the sperm, and this occurs inside the female reproductive tract. Capacitation of the sperm occurs within the female reproductive tract. If you were to take the sperm directly from the male and inject it around the eggs, it would not be able to immediately be able to fertilize the egg. It does have to hang out inside the female reproductive tract for a while before it becomes capacitated. And it takes about 7 hours. The sperm will not become able to actually fertilize the egg for about 7 hours. So again, the sperm has to remain within the female reproductive tract for about 7 hours to become capacitated and start really swimming around and finding that egg and being able to penetrate into it. So again, it does take some time for this to occur. And again, most of it doesn't ever get there. Sperm can survive in the female reproductive tract for about 48 hours. Which means if you're trying to get pregnant, again, the egg remains viable for a day, day and a half. The sperm can survive for about 48 hours. You've got about a 2 to 3 day window of opportunity here. A day before ovulation and a day or two after ovulation for this to occur. So again, it is a fairly limited window of opportunity for humans to become pregnant. A day or two before, a day or so before ovulation, and a day or so after ovulation is when pregnancy. Is when that's when you have to have sex if you want to get pregnant. I didn't get the right word out. But anyways, I did not get enough. So, secondly, as it turns out, when that sperm gets there, one sperm is not enough. It requires more than one sperm to get to where the egg is. And it requires more than one sperm to do this. Because as you will recall, when we release the egg, it's surrounded by all of these endometrial cells. Follicular cells, known as the corona radiata. The sperm has to eat its way through those follicular cells, and then on the inside of that, we have another layer in here, known as the zona pellucida. So again, the corona radiata, those are follicular cells that are hanging around on the outside of the cell, and the zona pellucida, that's this sort of this kind of jelly-like material that is surrounding the egg itself. The sperm has to be able to dig through those layers to reach the oocyte. The sperm has to dig through those layers. And that's where the acrosome comes in. Remember, on the end of the sperm, we have that sort of a cap on the end of the sperm called the acrosome. That contains enzymes that allow it to dig its way through these layers. It requires the enzymes from more than one acrosome to do this. So several sperm have to reach the egg in order for this to occur. Now remember, of that couple 100 million sperm, only 20 million or so ever became activated and started swimming effectively. Of those, most of them got lost on the way trying to get to the egg. Again, most of them just go the wrong way. It's only the ones who end up inside the uterine tube along with the egg that have a chance of doing this. And then it takes several of them to get enough to reach to where one will penetrate the egg. Once that occurs, however, that first sperm to make its way there will inject its nucleus into the oocyte, and the oocyte will very rapidly undergo a chemical change in its cell membrane that will then prevent any other sperm from getting in. Will then exclude any other sperm from getting in. Again, you only want one sperm to get there. If you put two in there, then you got too much DNA showing up and leads to very bad outcomes. It is not viable. So again, only one sperm can be allowed in. By the way, that event that occurs here on the surface of the egg here, that is similar to an action potential. It's a very rapid change in the cell membrane voltage is what happens. And that will then exclude any other sperm from getting in. So once again, once that occurs, that is what fertilization is. Once that occurs, the oocyte here, remember, it was stuck in metaphase 2. It will then complete the meiotic division and expel the second polar body. So here we have our egg as it was, our secondary oocyte as it was released. Again, you can see it sitting here in metaphase 2. Sperm comes along, one gets inside, fertilizes it, and we then expel the second polar body. We expel the second polar body at that point. The nucleus from the sperm, the nucleus from the egg, then join together. And again, so we have the nucleus of the sperm, we have the nucleus of the oocyte. They will then join together. Once that occurs, we have, instead of a oocyte, we now have a zygote. We now have what is called a zygote. A zygote being a fertilized egg. The zygote being a fertilized egg. So again, the nuclei of the oocyte and the sperm then fuse together and form the zygote. And as soon as that happens, we immediately undergo mitosis. We start to divide. As soon as those two nuclei fuse together, they start the mitotic divisions again. They start dividing up in what is known as cleavage. Cleavage is the division of that single cell into more and more cells. And it continues to divide and divide and divide. Remember, this is occurring in the uterine tube. This is occurring in the uterine tube. We are still making our way from the uterine tube into the uterus. We will not receive any nutrition for this zygote until we get into the uterus. So it's not going to actually grow any. It's just going to divide into more and more smaller and smaller cells. It's just going to keep dividing up into smaller and smaller cells. By the way, as soon as we divide from one cell into two, we are no longer a zygote. We are now an embryo. We have a 2-cell embryo, a 4-cell embryo, an 8-cell embryo, and we continue to divide. So the nuclei of the oocyte, the sperm come together, form the zygote, and then we start our cellular divisions one more time, forming the embryo. The cell formed, again, which I said that's what the zygote is. It undergoes mitosis, and we get a nice solid sphere of cells. That sphere of cells is called a morula. That sphere of cells is called a morula. And that sphere of cells is the same size as the zygote. Because again, we're not actually growing at this point, there's no nutrition coming in. And we're going to continue dividing, undergoing cleavage, and dividing, and dividing, and dividing. And we're going to keep dividing. The size of the embryo doesn't change, we simply get more and more cells occurring inside of it. And these cells are starting to differentiate. Differentiation has begun by the 4-cell stage. By the time you reach 4 cells, those cells are no longer identical. They've started to become different kinds of things. Eventually, the interior of the morula starts to not be full of cells anymore and becomes a hollow sphere instead. And that hollow sphere is called a blastocyst. A blastocyst is a hollow sphere of cells. And that is what is going to implant. We implant at the blastocyst stage. And on the inside of that blastocyst, we're going to have what is called the inner cell mass. And the inner cell mass is what will eventually form into the embryo proper, i.e. it's going to what eventually becomes the fetus. The outer cells, the cells that form the outside of the sphere, those are known as the trophoblast. These will turn into the placenta. So the inner cell mass, that will eventually turn into the new person. The outer cells will turn into the placenta over time. And again, implantation occurs at this stage. This is the stage at which implantation occurs. So what do I mean by implantation? The blastocyst will attach to the endometrial wall and dig its way in. Just like planting a seed into the garden is what's going to occur here. So again, taking a look at this, fertilization typically occurs way out here on day 0. Occurs out here, and this is where fertilization occurs. It can't occur a whole lot after this because the oocyte will no longer be viable. Again, that oocyte is only viable for about a day or so, and it doesn't get very far into the uterine tube before it no longer becomes viable. If it gets to about here, it's no longer viable. But again, fertilization typically occurs here and leads to removing the second polar body, and then we start to divide up. It takes about a day to get to the 2-cell stage, another day to 4, etc. And we see here what is known as a morula. The morula is that solid sphere of cells. And after about 4 or 5 days, that morula opens up and turns into a blastocyst instead. And the blastocyst looks something like this. Instead of being a solid sphere here, it is now hollow on the inside. And that hollow in here is called the blastocele. It's known as the blastocele. That will eventually become the yolk sac. But you'll notice the blastocyst here is not any bigger than the zygote that we started with. We have not started to grow. It is not until implantation actually occurs that we can actually get nutrition in here and actually allow these cells to actually grow. So for the first week or so, there has been no actual growth. We're just dividing the cells. But as you can see here, this inner cell mass is here on the inside. That will eventually develop into the embryo proper. And the cells are on the outside. That is known as the trophoblast. And that will eventually turn into the placenta. And this is what is going to then implant on day 7 or 7, 8, or 9, somewhere in that range. This will implant into the wall of the uterus. And by that end, it's going to grab hold and start to move its way in. At which point it will start encountering those endometrial glands, which will provide nutrition, and we can start to grow. At home. Speaking of the uterus, it looks something like this. So again, we already mentioned that the inner lining in here, this is the endometrium. Most of it is the myometrium, and then we have the perimetrium here on the outside. And you can see we've got a lot of blood vessels coming up into here, because again, that developing fetus is going to require a lot of nutrition to keep it going. Requires a lot of energy, a lot of nutrition coming in here. The endometrium itself is out here, and the endometrium itself is divided into 2 parts. we have what is called the functional zone and the basilar zone. The basilar zone is the inner, roughly, or rather the outer, roughly third of the endometrium. That is retained during menstruation. What is lost during menstruation is the functional zone out here. So again, that basilar zone remains so that we can regrow the functional zone every month. So the functional zone is sloughed off with the end of the menstrual cycle, at the beginning of the menstrual cycle, and the basilar zone is then going to allow it to regrow. So again, that's what that looks like. Again, there's a lot of blood coming into all of this. It is being supplied by the uterine artery, which then feeds into what are called the arcuate arteries, into the straight arteries, into the spiral arteries that actually come out into that functional zone. Again, the names of these are fairly obvious. Arcuate because they arch. Straight, they're straight. Spiral arteries out here are spiraling, forming sort of a helix in them. And those spiral arteries are going to be the ones that are going to interact with each other eventually. All right. So that's what all this looks like. By the way, I got a question on this over there. That endometrium in here, again, sloughs off every month and is replaced. In some women, there is a problem called endometriosis. That is where a piece of the endometrium ends up someplace other than inside the uterus. Again, this is something that could have happened during development, and one of those cells that was supposed to become the endometrium ended up someplace else. Typically inside the abdominal cavity somewhere. It is still going to respond to those same hormones in the same way, which means at the end of every month, it's going to try and slough off. And that's going to cause pain. That's going to cause pain and discomfort. So that's what endometriosis is. It's where a piece of the endometrium that's supposed to be inside the uterus is someplace else. And causing problems because it's someplace else, where it can't easily do what it's supposed to be doing. But it's going to thicken with the presence of estrogen, and it's going to die off in the absence of this every month. All right. So that is what the uterus looks like. And again, the functional zone is what is required for pregnancy to occur. The basilar zone remains behind, and we regrow from there. Which then brings us back to that embryo. I've been saying embryo and fetus a little bit here. I now need to tell you what we mean by those terms. The first portion of pregnancy, that's the embryonic phase. The later portions are the fetal stage. So what's the difference between an embryo and a fetus? Well, if I were to show you a fetus, you'd look at it and say, that's a human. That is a human fetus. If I were to show you an embryo, if I were to bring you a fish embryo, a dog embryo, and a human embryo and ask you which one was which, you probably would have a hard time telling me. An embryo doesn't really look human yet, a fetus does. That's the basic difference between the two. A fetus looks human, an embryo does not. So when do we switch from an embryo to a fetus? Well, ask 15 different people, you get 15 different answers. But generally speaking, it's at the end of the first trimester. Again, different people use different definitions as to exactly when you switch from one to the other. But most will, it'll be somewhere around 3 months. Around 3 months we switch from being an embryo and we become a fetus instead. During the embryonic phase, we are laying down all those organ systems that we need to grow and survive with. And during the fetal period, they're getting big enough for us to actually survive and continuing their development. So again, the embryonic period is from that first cleavage up to about 3 months. Up to about 3 months of pregnancy. The fetal period is then until birth. Now, one of the things that happens on very early during the embryonic period is something called gastrulation. By the way, I mentioned this before. Of those fertilized eggs, only about 30% of them will ever go to term. Again, we are not particularly good at reproduction. Most of the time, 70% of the time, it fails. The place where it fails most of the time is with implantation. That embryo makes its way through the uterine tube and just keeps going. It does not attach into the uterine wall the way it should. Again, only 1 in 3 embryos will actually implant correctly. If it fails to implant correctly, it washes out with the next menstrual flow. It washes out with the next menstrual flow. The second place where things tend to go horribly wrong is something known as gastrulation. Gastrulation happens a couple of 15 days into this. And during gastrulation, what happens is, I'll show you a figure of what this looks like. That embryo, as that inner cell mass as it starts to grow and develop, forms sort of a disc that then folds in on itself, and we end up with 3 distinct layers, called the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. By the time we've reached this stage of development, all your cells have decided what they're going to become. The skin cells already are going to become skin cells. The liver cells are already going to become livers, going to become part of the liver. Neurons are going to become neurons. So again, these cell lineages have differentiated to the point that they cannot go back. If you have something happen earlier than this, they have the potential to change their mind. But upon gastrulation, their fate is set. Their fate is set at that point. They've differentiated to a point where they can no longer go back. The endoderm is going to be the inner layer, and that's going to turn into the digestive system, the respiratory system, and your liver. That is going to come out of the endoderm. The mesoderm is going to go into the muscles and the gonads, and the ectoderm becomes your skin and the nervous system. Comes out of the ectoderm. So again, we're going to have 3 layers. The endoderm is the inner layer, the ectoderm is the outer layer, the mesoderm is in the middle. And the fate of these cell lineages has been decided by this point. And we're no longer looking at pluripotent stem cells. We are looking at specific cell lineages at this point. And if this does not occur correctly, pregnancy fails. Again, this occurs early on during development, before most women realize they're pregnant at all. This is occurring within the first month. So again, this occurs before most women are aware they're pregnant. Again, their period will be late, and it will just wash out with the menstrual flow. After this period, there's one other place where things go horribly wrong. And that is where we switch from being the embryonic stage into the fetal stage. But in the fetal stage, this is roughly the last 6 months, where we now have a fully functional placenta. It takes about 3 months to grow your placenta. And the placenta is responsible for producing those hormones that are required to maintain the pregnancy. Initially, it comes from the corpus luteum. The progesterone, the estrogens required to maintain pregnancy, they are produced by the corpus luteum. Later on, in the latter portions of pregnancy, it's the placenta that produces these hormones. And unfortunately, at the end of 3 months, the corpus luteum gets up and no longer produces these hormones, and the placenta is responsible for taking over. The placenta is responsible for taking over, and sadly, it does not always do so. And this is why many couples prefer not to tell people about a pregnancy until after the first trimester, because that's the other place where things go horribly wrong. And that the placenta no longer fails to produce the estrogen and progesterone required to maintain the pregnancy. It detaches and pregnancy fails. If you make it past that point, chances of going to term are very good. Chances are you'll make it to term. But again, that's the third place where things go very badly. Is when we switch to that being reliant on the placenta instead. Once we reach the fetal system, or fetal stage, our organ systems are pretty much there. They're not necessarily functional yet. They may not be fully developed, but they are at least beginning to be there. We have a heart. Your heart actually develops very early on. It's one of the first things to develop. Your brain is nowhere near functional yet, but it's there. Your liver is starting to work. Your lungs do not work yet. Your lungs don't actually work until after you're born. But again, they are there, and they're continuing to grow and develop depending on what they happen to be. The organ systems all grow and mature at very widely different rates. About the first thing that happens is we start to work on our brain and spinal cord, and they are about the last thing to finish. It takes a long time to grow a brain that works. So again, that happens continuously. Lungs are useless until after you're born. They develop late. Other things like your heart, you need the heart to sit there and pump the blood in you. It develops very early. Your heart starts beating quite early on. Not as early as the people tell you. But again, it does start to beat fairly early on. Because it needs to pump the blood around the fetus. One of the very last things that happens is you start making surfactants. Surfactant production doesn't occur until the very end of pregnancy, into the last few weeks of pregnancy. Which is why premature infants frequently have trouble breathing because they're not producing surfactant yet. They're not producing enough surfactant. All right, so those are some of the developmental phases that we need to take a look at. But again, it all starts up there with development of the embryo. Again, it makes it as far as the blastocyst stage before it makes it into the uterus. Again, it takes about a week for this to occur. So here we make it into the uterus. We see our nice trophoblast on the outside. We see our intermaster on the inside. And around day 6, 7, 8, somewhere in there, it attaches onto the uterine wall. And once that occurs, it starts to dig its way in by producing enzymes here that will destroy the cells in here and start feeding on them. And start pushing its way in here. Start making its way in here. And eventually it will make its way until it is entirely enveloped here by the endometrium. It will eventually be entirely enveloped in here. So the enzymes in the outer cells of the blastocyst digest the endometrial lining and it burrows its way in. And that is what is known as implantation. Again, this is where things are most likely to go wrong. This only occurs about only about a third of the time this is go correctly. Most of the time this doesn't work. The outer cells are also going to produce something called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. This mimics LH. And why do we need to mimic LH? Because that's going to maintain the corpus luteum. That is going to allow us to maintain the corpus luteum. And this is how the corpus luteum knows a pregnancy has occurred, through the production of HCG. Would anyone care to guess what a home pregnancy test is testing for? Yeah, HCG is measuring this hormone. This hormone is being produced by the embryo to allow the mother's body to know that she is in fact has a embryo present. And it will produce the HCG to maintain the corpus luteum for the first 3 months of the pregnancy. Is that a question?
To what would they attribute a false positive on a pregnancy test? Like, why would that hormone be showing up if they weren't pregnant?
Probably because it was an inviable embryo, or non-viable embryo, which could occur for a number of different reasons. It could be that there was some mutation within there that just was not compatible with life, which happens a lot. All of us are carrying a number of genes that are defective. For the most part, they're recessive genes, and unless you find somebody else has that same mutation, it's not an issue. So it could be that there's something defective genetically, and it's just not viable, and it's just not going to be there. That's the most likely probability. There are others, but yeah. By the way, when we talk about pregnancy, from a medical standpoint, pregnancy begins with implantation. This is when we say you're pregnant. If it doesn't implant, we don't count that as a pregnancy. Any event, because they failed Any event, once it makes its way in here, you can see that intercell mass begins to continue developing. And here we start to see it lift off from this side over here, and we're starting to see a cavity form on the other side over here. This will eventually become what is known as the amniotic cavity. And that will eventually form into what is known as the amniotic cavity. So again, as we continue to grow and develop here, as we start making our way in here, again, this is around day 9, we're starting to reach into and hook up with some of these endometrial glands, which are going to feed our embryo. They're going to sit here and feed our embryo. We can see we've got the amniotic cavity starting to form on this side. This side over here will form what is known as the yolk sac. This will be the yolk sac over on this side. And this is what is known as the embryonic disc. This is what is known as the embryonic disc. The embryonic disc will eventually form into the fetus. But as you can see here, as we're trying to dig our way inside of here, we're getting these little projections that hang out here. This is the very beginnings of the development of the placenta. We are starting to develop the placenta at this point. And these will eventually develop into what are called chorionic villi. And this is where we're going to see the exchange of nutrients and gases with the maternal blood supply. We're also seeing some open spaces called lacunae showing up in here. These will fill up with blood. And that is where we're going to get our nutrition from as we continue to grow. Again, on day 10, we've continued to develop a little bit more. Things are going to start happening fairly rapidly here. You can see that we've now dug our way entirely into the uterine wall. We are continuing to produce enzymes that are allowing us to dig our way out here. We're lifting farther away here. Once again, we have our yolk sac over here, and now we have a cavity on this side known as the amniotic cavity. It is going to fill up with fluid known as amniotic fluid. And again, the embryonic disc is forming there in the middle. The trophoblast now has two parts of it. It has the cellular trophoblast, which was part of the blastocyst, and also has what is known as the syncytial trophoblast, and that is coming from the maternal side. That is where the enzymes have degraded the cells out here to enable the embryo to sit there and basically feed off of it. So again, that is what is going on in here. Again, we're seeing lacunae beginning to develop. And those will eventually fill up with blood and allows a way to get in contact with the maternal blood supply. And as we continue to grow and develop, you can see that we're starting to develop a number of different membranes going on in here. And there are a number of different embryonic membranes that are going to form. First of all, we have the yolk sac. That yolk sac is going to form around the blastocele. That's the inner portion of the blastocyst. And it is going to feed that embryo until we're able to get nutrition from the mother. It's going to be there as a source of nutrition. This is also where our first blood cells are going to form. This is also where our first blood cells will form. It will eventually be absorbed into the gut. It will eventually be absorbed into the embryonic gut. We also have what is called the amnion. The amnion is forming around that amniotic cavity. It will eventually completely envelop the entire fetus. It will be filled with what is called amniotic fluid. And that fluid is there to cushion and protect the developing embryo and fetus later on. That amniotic fluid in there is what comes out when the water breaks. So again, early stages of labor, that amniotic cavity ruptures and all this fluid comes out. That's amniotic fluid in there. Again, it was there to support and protect the developing fetus. We then have a structure known as the endoderm, and this is coming out of the endoderm down by the yolk sac. This is a waste disposal site. Prior to developing the placenta, we have no way to get rid of our waste, so we dump it into here. This will eventually form into the bladder. Gives rise to the urinary bladder. And the chorion is then on the outside. This surrounds the entire blastocyst on the outside and will eventually form into the placenta. This is what eventually becomes the placenta. And that is known as the chorion, and it will be on the outside. So again, we'll see these different areas of embryonic membranes beginning to form. Around day 12, we have gastrulation taking place. So again, at this point, we are within the uterus. We have implanted successfully. And now we're going to develop those three distinct layers that I mentioned earlier. And what we're going to see here is the ectoderm is here on the outside. The endoderm is over here on the inside of the next to the yolk sac. This is facing the amniotic cavity on this side. And you can see this, we're starting to see migration of cells in here and populating the space in between here. This becomes the mesoderm. This becomes the mesoderm inside. We get what is called the primitive streak here, and because that's exactly what it looks like, it's just a little roof. And these cells fold in on themselves and form three distinct layers. Again, the endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm hanging out there. All within that embryonic disc. At this point, these cells are fated to become muscle cells or the gonads. These cells over here, these will become the digestive tract and a few other parts. These cells over here, these will become the skin and the reproductive system. Not reproductive, nervous system, the nervous system. So again, we've already decided by this point what the fate of these cells will be. Meaning, if I were to take one of these endoderm cells here and put it over here, it would still turn into a liver cell. It would still become whatever it was originally intended to become. These have gone past the point at which they are able to turn into something else. Their fate is sealed at this point. And again, that's day 12. That's day 12. For more details, there's a nice table in your book that tells you what each of these different layers goes into. Again, if you're really interested, go ahead and look at this list and feel free to memorize it if you like. I'm not going to test you on it. Again, I'm not going to bother testing you on it. This is way too much information for this course. But again, you can see here the ectoderm comes up here, forms most of the nervous system, forms most of the but forms most of the nervous system, most of the skin. Where's skin at here? There at the top. Forms most of the skin up there on top. The mesoderm, big place, the skeletal system, and the muscular system. Your bones and muscles come out of the mesoderm. The endoderm goes into the endocrine system and the digestive system and the urinary system. Again, different systems develop out of these different layers. And we will continue to grow and develop. By week 2, we look something like this. By the way, this is week 2 post. This is week 2 post-implantation, post-fertilization. If you are measuring how many weeks into pregnancy we are, this is 4 weeks. Pregnancy is counted from the day of last menstruation, which is 2 weeks earlier. So when people are talking about 15 weeks and 24 weeks, subtract 2 weeks from that in terms of developmental age. Because again, that occurs earlier. So 6 weeks in is really early. But anyway, this is week 2 going on here. And you see here, we're continuing to develop. We've got a little stalk here that we've moved out here. This eventually turns into the umbilical cord. And again, we're going to continue to grow and develop. And in week 2, something really good happens. And this is the formation of the neural tube. This is what's known as the neural tube. And we're going to see here as we now have up here, this is the head. This is the tail. How did I know? I read the figure. Because I can't tell the difference either. But again, embryologists can look at this and tell which end is the head and which end is the tail. These neural plates up here, that's the beginning of your brain. That's the beginning of your brain. This groove down here, that's your spinal cord. That's your spinal cord starting to form. So we're starting to form the central nervous system. The somites, those will become your limbs. These will become the limbs. These become the limbs. And again, this is what it looks like in about 2 weeks. Again, when people talk about neural tube defects, like spina bifida, this is when it's occurring. This is when it's occurring, very early on. And again, take your folic acid. That makes this go the way it's supposed to go. Again, this is why you want to take all these prenatal vitamins. Again, we're going to continue to grow and develop. By week 3, we've gotten a little bit bigger, but notice we haven't really hit the edge of the wall of the uterus much yet. At this point, if you look at somebody, you have to look very hard to tell that they were pregnant by week 3. So again, this is not something that would be easily seen. We are talking very, very small still at this point. but we're now getting that yolk sac formed very well. Here's our amniotic sac forming on this side. Here's the head over here. Here's the tail over here. And we're going to simply continue growing as we continue to get larger and larger. As we continue development here, again, you can see the head starting to come around over here. Here's the tail over here. Here's our allotrough, our yolk sac being absorbed in. At this point, we still have not made contact with the maternal blood supply. So again, we're continuing to grow. We're getting nutrition, and we're starting to see a slight bump on the interior wall of the uterus. This is a one thing. This is one thing. By the way, this is 6 weeks of pregnancy. This is 6 weeks of pregnancy, 6 weeks old. All right, and that is, again, this is before most women realize, this is about when the next menstrual period would be. This is when most women start to realize they're pregnant. Having said that, here's a picture of an embryo at this stage. If I was to look at this and tell you, does that look like a human? No. This is still an embryo. Very obviously, this is still an embryo. Again, in the embryonic stage, we can't really see a whole lot. I'm pretty sure this is the heart right here because, again, it has formed very early on, and it is going to be red. This is the yolk sac hanging out over here. This is the head. This is the tail. These, I think, are the lymph buds. I'm not sure. That's probably the eye. Again, that's rest of the form very early on. But otherwise, your guess is as good as mine as what parts these are. So again, that's what you look like pretty early on. All right, we will continue on and talk more about this stuff next time. Talk about what happens during childbirth and what happens after we're born and how we can prevent it from